Well, I should start with a confession. I was a fervent Obama volunteer, and for the past close to 2 years now, I have had an increasingly angry discussion with myself about which issue area of the federal policies distresses me most. But that's aside from education, because it's very clear to me that the federal education policies are an unmitigated disaster, with a couple of exceptions, which I'll do quickly, because superintendents actually mentioned two of them. I think that the federal government's Promised Neighborhoods grant program, which tries to invest at the neighborhood level into the kinds of supports that students need in order to succeed in school, is a good idea. I think the Common Core standards the superintendent talked about and the new generation of assessments is a good idea, though actually watching some of the other stuff roll out, I'm now more worried about those than I was before. But the Race to the Top program and the ancillary programs that have been based on competitive grants around the country, I think are disasters. They're based on a set of assumptions that charter schools work, that you can evaluate teachers by their test scores, that teacher tenure has to be ended because it preserves scores of bad teachers, and if you see Waiting for Superman, bad teachers is the #1 problem that causes school failure in America. None of these assumptions, which the administration has actually made into dogma, have any research support at all. The research on charter schools is quite clear. In most cases, charter schools do no better than equivalent and comparable public schools, and in some cases, they do much worse. And later on, I'll say why I think that's true. It's not necessarily the fault of charter schools. I think charter school operators are to be commended for actually locating their charter schools in predominantly poor areas that serve African American and Latino students, which is a clue to why their results aren't any better. There is no research base for assuming, A, that if you base teacher evaluations on test scores, you will do something useful, and B, the research also says that the systems of evaluation based on test scores, mostly they're value added, which the superintendent talked about, are at this stage so unreliable that they cannot be used to actually evaluate teachers because the range of variation is so enormous. And there was a new study about 6 months ago out from the federal government's Institute for Education Sciences that said this in chapter and verse. Right? The most astounding thing to me is that an administration that claims that it cares about data and research is actually promulgating programs that have no research basis at all. It's the triumph of a particular neoliberal ideology, which is so convinced that it knows what the truth is that it doesn't have to bother with research. It wouldn't be so bad if there wasn't going to be incredible damage from these kind of programs. Example, Race to the Top is replacing formula-driven programs based on need, and need is mostly economic need, families of students, with competitive grants in which there are winner and loser states. If you win, you get a good pile of money. If you lose, you get nothing. Whereas in the past, you got Title I support based on the needs of your children, right? Whether you had a good grant writer in your state ed department or not. These are programs that are being funded based on proposals. I know in New York State that we will not implement the proposals that we wrote. We will get some way in some of them, and I mean, if you've ever written a proposal and then tried to implement it, you know what the gap is between proposals and realities. We are sending billions of dollars on a guess that states will deliver on their proposals. And again, more than half the states will get no money at all because they lost. The school improvement grant, which the administration is funding to the tune of several $billion, will identify more than 2,000 schools as schools that have to be turned around, 1.5 million kids. There are 4 mandated routes, programs, I don't know what else to call them, that you have to choose one of if you're in a district that has 1, 2, 3, 4 of these schools. Superintendent just talked about one. Right? None of the 4 routes to improvement that you have to choose have any research justification whatsoever. In fact, there's a lot of research that says that every one of the choices don't work. And they come out of places like New York and Chicago. The Consortium for school, I can't remember what it's called in Chicago, and the New School in New York City have actually studied whether these turnaround programs work, and they followed kids. When they closed a school that moved from one school to another, the kids didn't do any better after their school was closed and they were put in another school. And the other turnaround models similarly have no research basis at all. So what you've got, and this started with Bush and not with Obama, you have an enormous expansion of federal power. Because up until Bush, right, the Title I monies that flowed to states and cities for student need didn't come with any strings attached. The Bush administration was the first administration that realized that they could actually force federal policy into local education governance by tying it to Title I. That's what NCLB is all about. And saying to states, well, you don't have to take it. But if you take Title I, you have to follow our policies or else you lose the money. The Obama administration has gone a step further and actually transformed category grants into competitive grants and created winners and losers, when every state and every district is dependent on that money. So we're in an arena in which the expansion of federal power could be beneficial and could be dangerous depending on what those specific policies are. And I think this far the record will indicate that the Obama administration's federal policies are based on, at best, a wish that they know what the right answers are, but no research justification at all. Very quickly, how much time do I have? What should we be doing instead of this? All right. James Coleman in the 60s did the first landmark national study funded by Congress and discovered, and it was not his assumption or Congress's assumption, but discovered that the most reliable predictor of student school performance was their family background. It was a very negative and depressing conclusion, and lots of people used it to argue that schools don't matter. And as a corollary, money doesn't matter, and good teaching doesn't matter, because it's really your background that determines how well or poorly you'll do in school. Americans are predisposed not to believe that kind of finding. And so we've spent many years trying to disprove it. And what we have actually done is to have created particular schools, we call them outlier schools, in which that correlation, background, achievement, doesn't work. The superintendent's right, those schools are exceptional schools. That's the schools that you found in your study. But the problem for all of us is that the success tends not to last. It manages for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. The schools change in a variety of ways. Personnel changes, policies shift, and then the curve of achievement goes down again. So if you believe, as I do, that demography is not destiny and you can actually triumph over, let's call it the depredations of background, what should we do? We should support programs like the Harlem Children's Zone. And though I think Waiting for Superman has it come to Maine yet? No. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. Well, if it comes, I can't imagine it won't come. If it comes, see it, though it is a very pernicious film, because at least it will give you a definition of what a full-scale community-based student support program looks like. Costing, by the way, over $100 million a year, but still. So we should develop all kinds of support programs for kids, but most important, we should have universal pre-K programs that are full-day and full funded, because the gap between what advantaged kids bring to the schoolhouse door and what kids who weren't fortunate enough to have those advantages bring gets bigger the more time you spend at school. But we have lots of research that indicates that good preschool programs can reduce, if not take away completely, that gap. And lots of European countries put us to shame in terms of the nature of preschool that they provide as opposed to what we don't provide. Secondly, we need extended day and year programs so that kids who come to school with the disadvantages of poverty and poor health and second languages and not speaking English and a whole range of other things that living, particularly in the poor sections of cities, produces, we need to help them recuperate their education. And the best way to recuperate it is to increase the time. And you increase the time of the school day and the school year, you have lots of time to do the kinds of differentiated instruction that pays attention to how kids learn and their needs that you can't do in a regular school day. That's the fourth thing we should do. We should find ways, and the programs exist, to differentiate instruction so that kids are not sitting in a room in which 30 people are doing the same thing, so that their individual and particular learning needs, which vary enormously in every classroom, can be I was going to say diagnosed, I hate that word because there's the medical model underneath it, but can be properly assessed or appropriately assessed, and then a program of instruction that makes sense to that kid and will move that kid through what they need to learn will happen. And finally, we need far more investment in teacher skills and capacities, right? And that's what some of you do. Teachers take an enormously bad rap in this country, undeservedly, but we also spend less in terms of teacher development, we call it professional development, and support than most European countries, and we also force our teachers to spend more time in classroom and less time working with each other on preparation, on planning, on curriculum, and on assessment than most other countries do. And am I up? Okay, finally, I'm particularly upset by the teacher bashing that's going on around the country under the guise of, or under the notion that somehow our primary problems in American education are caused by bad teaching. I've been trying an experiment across the country, and it depends on memory, and memory is always faulty, but think back to your own K-12 school years and try to identify how many bad teachers you had. Very subjective, and maybe some of them were so bad that there's a whole period that's blacked out and you can't even remember. But try to do that, and then figure out how many teachers total have you had and what percentage that is. My gamble is that you won't get to 5%. And if all this fuss is about less than 5%, and I think it's much less than that, by the way, of bad teachers, then how can we blame the problems of public education in America on bad teaching?